Earth in contemporary times and Earth in the past. There are scenes that happen in the 1960s and at other times in recent Chinese history. So it's a very comprehensive novel, and actually I'm not going to be talking about it very much today because I want to focus on a particular kind of science fiction, which I have a couple of other examples of here, but it makes a nice picture anyway. So what I wanted to say by way of introduction is that statistics about China's rise to political and economic prominence, such as it being now the world's largest carbon emitter, the world's second largest economy, you often hear about its breakneck growth, unprecedented in world history. More recently, I think it was announced that the Chinese government declared that by 2025 they would no longer sell gas or diesel automobiles. It would be only electric. Massive investment in renewable energy technology and production. So in China today, as a result partly of this economic development and government policies, kind of looks like the way we used to imagine cities of the future back when I was a kid in the 1960s. This is the riverfront landscape of Pudong district of Shanghai, which looks like it has a rocket ship growing out of it and has all this very aggressive sort of postmodern or ultra futuristic architecture. So architecture is one of the ways that sort of symbolizes the sense in which China seems to be already in the future, right? It's like living in a science fiction novel, a fantastic planet. A couple of other examples, my wife from Chengdu will appreciate this, is this enormous global, what's it called, the New Century Global Center. I think it comes, there it is, New Century Global Center. Part of it is a resort. It's sort of office building, it does everything. It's a shopping mall. It is 18 million square feet, which means that if any of you have been to the Mall of America in my hometown of Minneapolis, it's more than 4 times bigger than the Mall of America. And so it's one of the largest buildings in the world. I don't remember what the square footage of the Pentagon is, but I think it's right up there with that. And inside of it, you can also find a 5-star resort hotel that's entirely indoors with tropical swimming and little cottages through here. And you can't see, I think it's behind where the camera is here, but there's also an amusement park inside here, indoors. And so this all gives you this feeling of like the world of the future, more than the world of the present, and the peasant, which is a little bit different than our traditional conceptions of contemporary China. Of course, massive renewable energy, as I mentioned, the wind farm projects. This doesn't even give you a glimpse of the scale. The problem with photographs is these things in China are so big you cannot capture them in a photographic image the way the naked eye perceives of them. But I drove through one of these driving into Urumqi, it's the capital of Xinjiang province in the northwest, and you see these windmills coming in the distance, and they just gradually grow up to completely dominate the landscape on a scale that we never see. And of course, you probably all heard many years ago the Three Gorges Dam project, which is the biggest hydroelectric dam in the world. Again, the photograph doesn't really do justice to the scale. I took a snapshot actually back when they were still working on it, which I think was more illustrative because we could look like from one end of the dam to the other with all of the construction cranes still up. And there were literally dozens and dozens of cranes, the likes of which you only see a handful of in any American city working on this at the same time. And you know, I think part of the problem with photography is that on a scale this large, the people are just too small to see. It's not that they look like ants; it's that you literally cannot see the people in the picture because it's too broad or wide of a picture. And of course, you might also have heard that, frequently, the U.S. government, especially in the Obama administration, talks about how bullet trains are kind of a symbol of China's development. These were built, and you can see, you know, the bullet train's a familiar sight. You've seen them in Japan, but you can also see from the trellises and the tracks that they're built on that this is an immense construction effort where most of the major cities in China were connected on a new rail network of bullet trains that allowed you to be able to travel from one city to another, usually in only part of one day, 6 hours, 12 hours, for train rides that used to take multiple days. But of course, like any other aspect of development, there are risks. And so, for example, in 2011, 2 of these bullet trains had a head-on collision in Wenzhou, killing 40 people and causing a great controversy about whether development was happening too fast. So how does this relate to science fiction? Well, going back to my youth again, back in the 60s, when I was growing up, a big part of popular culture was imagining what the world of the future would look like, the city of the future. And you can sort of see some resemblance in these artistic conceptions to the picture of Shanghai I showed you earlier before, and also the New Century Global Center. You see, in addition to gleaming skyscrapers, you see a lot of bubbles. Hopefully, I don't think they were as aware of the dangers of pollution back in the 60s, but I think the idea of a bubble just seemed kind of like high class and gleaming and unique. Of course, there are lots of automobiles driving around on the roads still, but you'd have these elevated monorail tracks and things like that. So transportation was conceived in a way that we've seen in many cases come to reality. Here's a depiction also from the 1960s of what New York might look like in the future, and of course we're living in the future now. I think they were probably only thinking out to about the early decades of the 21st century. Funny how the cars look like they were designed in the 1960s. They weren't able to predict, what automobile design would do. But again, we got a lot of elevated light rail or kinds of monorail situations. Here's a monorail up here. A lot of this imagination was about transportation, and the building piece was not all that different, although one picture I didn't include in here, which you'll find if you Google this, the imagination of the city of the future, is the Jetsons. If you ever watched the Jetsons, they had quite a different situation with buildings. All of the buildings were on these high sort of posts way up in the sky, and so everybody drove around in flying cars, and nobody was on the ground at any time. So everything was up in the sky. Here, by contrast, you see the skyline of New York still being sort of safe, as it were, on the ground. Now, so when we looked at that picture of the collided train, we started to think about the costs, the human costs of rapid development, and also maybe some of the hidden or darker side of development. And this is where you can see another trend in science fiction come up, because of course early science fiction was often aspirational. It was often also based on this imagination of all of the wonderful things we could enjoy and luxuries and so forth in the world of the future. And this was true in the Chinese case too. Actually, there were some novelists writing even as many as 110 or 120 years ago, partly influenced by traditional Chinese literature, but also influenced by translations of authors like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne into Chinese, thinking about what China would look like 50, 60, 70 years in the future. And a lot of it was just about how problems that we see in the society of today will be solved in the future. But science fiction took another turn, I think, throughout the course of the 20th century, particularly after World War II, in the direction of sort of looking at the darker side. And I learned a new word when I was starting to do research on this. I forgot, I think it was the summer before last, I was teaching a course in Hong Kong, which was about the image of Hong Kong in literature and film. And I learned some interesting things about the connection of images of Hong Kong with the history of science fiction globally, or even you might say centered in the United States. So you get this thing called cyberpunk, which is a very exotic sounding word, and it sounds like it's too hip for people my age to be talking about. But it's really actually a definite genre of science fiction that has very relevant characteristics for my talk today. And it's really it's a science fiction of disillusionment. It looks, rather than looking at the distant future, it looks at the so-called near future. What will the world look like in 7 years? What will the world look like in 10 years? And it's usually with a negative emphasis of the development of negative trends in society, particularly economic development and the creep of technology into our personal lives. We hear about this on the radio. We hear about this all the time, for example, with respect to privacy of personal information and things like that. but also concerns over the environment. Another thing that cyberpunk often has in it are hybrid beings who are partly human and partly machines, or cyborgs, which is obviously not quite as realistic as we have now, but we do have virtual reality. There is a lot of work being done on artificial intelligence now, as well as bionics, if you remember the $6 Million Man, making workable, smart prosthetic limbs and things like that. All of this falls into this category of this sort of hybrid human machine. And then the vision of society is changed greatly in cyberpunk from the aspirational, gleaming, beautiful world of old-time science fiction. It's a vision of overcrowded, vertical, sort of urban caverns and sunless cities that people live in squalor, usually. And there are real historical Asian inspirations for this vision. If you recall the movie Blade Runner, the original one from 1982, this is like the iconic cyberpunk vision of society. This is Los Angeles conceived in 2019. That's 2 years from now, right? But it was, what, 25 years from when the movie was made. But it doesn't look like Los Angeles. It looks like Hong Kong. It looks like Jakarta. It looks like a kind of poor, kind of wild city in Asia. All the signage, of course, being in Japanese, but you all get the little, people making food on street stalls, the crowding, and the darkness, which is very much part of the world of Blade Runner. Of course, we know this year a new version of Blade Runner came out, which pushed it back to 2049, a good, comfortable interval into the future, but it's still this sort of film noir, dark vision of society, still with Chinese characters on the signage. It's still Los Angeles. And so this sort of Asian theme is part of the cyberpunk theme. What I learned that I didn't really realize when I was doing the course on Hong Kong is that this vision of what Los Angeles would look like in the future was based on what Hong Kong looked like in the present in the 1980s. What you're looking at now is a Japanese artist's depiction of a cross-section of the Kowloon walled city, which was destroyed in 1994. And I can zoom in a little bit, not as far as I'm sure any of us would like, but each one of these square pictures is like, it's like an apartment where a family would be living. And so you see clothes hanging from hangers and people moving boxes around. There's somebody sitting on a toilet. So it's like this immensely densely packed humanity. And it's very vertical, right? You have one building here, it ends here, and this is empty space, and you got people drying their clothes out of their windows here, and they're almost close enough to jump across, right? There's hardly anything that you would call a street in the Kowloon walled city. I gotta back out of this. Like that, right? And so one thing that interests me about this is that there was a team of Japanese illustrators that were so fascinated with this living circumstance that they made this painstaking cross-section drawing of what life inside the walled city was. This is an aerial view of the actual Kowloon walled city, and you can see how densely packed it is, so that the illustration shows itself to be a very accurate representation. There's no room in there for a street. These are just buildings that are about maybe 15 to 20 stories high. They're probably higher than they should be. They've been added onto, and they're all so close to each other that they almost just form one solid unit. And so obviously Hong Kong felt like this was a problem. I think it had the highest population density in the world. Before they tore it down, I think there were 50,000 people living in this area. I can't remember the acreage, but it was very small. And that's what made the population density so high. But here's a ground view of it in the evening when the lights are starting to get turned on. So it just gives you this sort of idea of this vertical slum kind of feeling that you get also from the cyberpunk kind of vision. And it's not only Blade Runner. There are many novelists and novels that sort of partake in this aesthetic in science fiction. So you can see a connection with Asia here. But what is the connection with documentary filmmaking in China? Well, one of the points I want to make is this disillusionment with development that is common among cultural figures in contemporary China, but particularly independent documentary filmmakers, because they are what does it mean to be independent as a documentary filmmaker in China? Well, China has a state administration. It used to be called for Radio, Television, and Film, SARFT, but they changed their name and made it even longer, so it became an unpronounceable acronym. But anyway, anybody who wants to make a film traditionally in China or publish a book of any kind, creative or nonfiction or scholarly, has to get permission from this administration. They're in effect censors before they shoot the film, in the case of a filmmaker, having their script reviewed. And so the film that you see released in theaters in China that's not foreign, the locally produced Chinese films, are all films that have been approved in this manner. They have been censored, the scripts probably having been self-censored before they're delivered to the authorities. Independent documentary filmmakers decided to break out of this system, even though it meant a high cost in terms of the potential audience. And so starting in about 1990, filmmakers like Wu Wenguang and a lot of his friends and associates, Huang Weikai, I think I might have, let's see how we're doing with time. Well, I won't have time to show a clip from a Huang Weikai film. I'll just show you clips from one film by Wang Jiuliang. He's a much later documentary filmmaker. Had this common sense of distance from the party line, the national interest and things like that, and decided to take an sort of apologetic, critical stance to the problems in society. And so often documentary filmmakers were showing the invisible and sometimes tragic or ugly aspects of the underside of development, you might say. So you could compare this picture to the Kowloon walled city. This is a photograph by Wang Jiuliang of a scavenger community living on a landfill outside of Beijing. So basically, these are people who live off of the landfill and on the landfill. They build their houses out of construction waste. They wear clothes that they pick up out of the garbage dump. They eat food that they get out of the garbage dump. So it creates a whole kind of anti-society or a hidden dark society. He made this film called Beijing Besieged by Waste in 2011. It started out as a photography essay project. He was concerned about the consequences for the environment of the growing consumerism in contemporary China. And so he decided to go out and look at landfills and see how the management of garbage was going. And he was so incensed by what he saw in terms of illegal practices, environmentally dangerous practices, inhumane behavior, and inhumane living conditions, that he decided to make a feature-length documentary film out of this, which includes a lot of these large format sort of landscape photographs that he took along the way. He's a professional photographer. So one of the, I think, really remarkable things about this film is that it is artistically made. And I'm not going to be able to demonstrate that as well as I should be able to in a longer lecture format. But I think there are a lot of documentary films. What makes Wang Jiuliang's films different than other people's films is this sense of massive scale and a kind of an ironical aesthetic, whereby the landscape, which is inhumane and made up of the detritus of contemporary civilization, is somehow still aesthetically impressive. This is the scene, this is from the middle of the scene from the beginning of the movie. I have a clip here I can show you about 30 seconds of, in which he does something else actually quite interesting with the aesthetics, where he takes you away from the level of ordinary ground. So you get a lot of high-angle shots to give a sense of the scale of what's going on here, and the sense in which garbage is everywhere. It's like you can't see the end of the garbage. And then he splices it with this backing out from an aerial satellite photograph of where that location you just saw was, which is marked by a yellow pin. and you see the yellow pins of similar locations in the outskirts of Beijing. As you get further and further out, you see that the city of Beijing is completely surrounded by hundreds of these horrific landfills. Beijing besieged by waves. So that's just the beginning of the film. And so I didn't get the highest quality here, but he takes these shots very carefully and makes them into kind of an aesthetic experience, which adds, I think, effectively to the impact. Another one where he uses satellite imagery is this clip, and the subtitles sort of tell you what's going on here. What he's basically doing is he's describing a system whereby material is extracted from nature and then pushed back into nature in the form of garbage. So he says he's talking about extraction of minerals from mountains.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
If this doesn't get approval from the government or the censors, is there personal risk to the filmmaker that there'd be some sort of consequences or retaliation?
Right, I'll just let the clip finish first. Okay, that's a very good question. I should have probably completed the story about independent documentary filmmakers. Most of them were already people who learned filmmaking in official organs like the media, the China Central Television, or in film schools. And so they were savvy about the situation in the cultural world and the film world in particular. And so they would not be very conspicuous in their showing and distribution of these films. They're often targeting international film festivals, some of which are devoted to documentary filmmaking only. For some reason, as far as I know, there isn't as much pressure or control on the creative products of Chinese filmmakers who are showing in international film festivals. I think part of this is that the orientation of the propaganda ministry and the administration for radio, art, and film is they're worried about the impact on the population. And film is particularly sensitive to them because it has a much broader impact than literature in writing. There is an audience for this within China because there's always an audience for films that are not released in the theater who've been able to obtain access to films through pirated DVDs, through clever means of moving around the internet. For example, you might have heard that there's this great firewall whereby the government has made it possible to block a large part of the internet from the Chinese population, but people who are motivated to do so or need to for professional reasons have found ways to get around the Great Firewall so they can see things that are released on the internet, including films like these, which are often more easily available through the internet. So your question, though, is about whether they're in danger. And I can't say that they're not in danger, although I haven't heard stories about filmmakers being victimized in the way that people who write about politics are thrown into jail without being accused of anything. So they don't belong, I think it's fair to say, to the category of prisoners of conscience. They are not persecuted in that direct sense. But the pressure of censorship requires that they use all kinds of means and subterfuge in order to get around government scrutiny. So the government is less concerned about what you're making than they are about who gets to see it. And so that is the sort of the way the mechanism of censorship works in China. So I want to relate this back to contemporary Chinese science fiction. So many of these documentaries make use of, as I was saying, dramatic visual spectacles, strange or stunning camera angles or shots that make China from the perspective of the subject of the film, which would be, for the example, the irresponsible management of garbage in legal and illegal landfills around Beijing, the day-to-day lives of retired elderly people, massive labor migration across China that breaks up families and often leaves children in the countryside in the care of their grandparents or even to fend for themselves, or a collage of amateur video of strange happenings around the southern megalopolis of Guangzhou, formerly known as Canton, or the daily lives of drug addicts. These are typical subject matters of documentary filmmakers. It suddenly occurred to me that there's a kind of overlap between these two different genres. If cyberpunk dystopian visions of what China would be like 10 or 12 years from now, a lot of independent documentaries give the impression that their subjects are already living in a cyberpunk novel, basically. The forces that may alienate characters in science fiction novels could also be afflicting the actual people appearing in documentary films. So there's two stories I want to talk about here in the time I have remaining. I'm just going to flip through a couple more slides while I'm talking about these stories. There was a more recent film last year by Wang Jiuliang, same director as Beijing Besieged by Waste, called Plastic China, where he was investigating the statistic he found that China had become the largest importer in the world of waste plastic from the U.S. and Europe and everywhere else in the world, and then they would recycle under inhuman conditions. And so in this case, you have a very sort of cyberpunk sort of landscape of waste plastic, right? That becomes the landscape of the lives of the people living in it. And so interestingly, I want to get a citation of that's also from Plastic China. I just want to show my citations, even though that's the last slide on the screen, so you know what I'm talking about. There's this novel, or short novel, by Hao Jingfang, a woman writer from Beijing, that was just written in 2014 and won the Hugo Award in 2015 for an English translation, called Folding Beijing. And interestingly, the protagonist of Folding Beijing is a waste management employee in a future version of Beijing. It's about 50 years in the future. That is divided into 3 independent and mutually inaccessible spaces and sections of the day for 3 different classes of human beings. You have first space, second space, and third space. Anybody read this story? It was in the media. It's quite interesting, and you can get the collection. It's included in Invisible Planets through Kindle or otherwise as an ebook. So these spaces displace each other in an enormous mechanical folding process that takes place every 48 hours. So the way in which they've made the city into a machine that kind of flips itself over on a regular basis to clear out space for other sectors of the population to use for a section of time kind of reminds us of the scale of the bullet train project and these enormous buildings that they build and have the biggest hydroelectric dam and so forth. So every 48 hours, there is this event called the change in which the city flips over. Actually, every 24 hours, it flips. So 24 hours belong to first space they get to use. And then the next 24 hours is divided into 2 parts, which can be used in succession by second space residents and third space residents. There are 5 million, I think, people in first space. There are 25 million people in second space, and there are 50 million people in third space, for a total of 80 million people. So they've made a way to make Beijing inhabitable by a much larger population than it has now, but people have to be asleep a lot more of the time. The 50 million people out of 80 million people in third space get 8 hours every 48 hours of waking time. And most of these people, I think 80% of them, are waste management people. Basically, they manage the waste for all 3 spaces. So here again, you get this depiction of the invisible underside of development. And this story is told from the point of view of one of these waste management employees. So this waste management employee named Lao Dao is recruited by means of a message in a bottle that's sent through the garbage to go to second space and meet the guy who sent the bottle, who's a student. Second space is sort of made up of aspirational middle or upper middle class people. The universities are all in second space. And first space is just this kind of very glitzy, high-tech environment where all the movers and shakers, the wealthy business people and banks exist. So in a way, if you look at Beijing today, you can already see the outlines of first, second, and third spaces, right? There are a lot of places that are where people are living like migrant laborers in sort of slum-like conditions in unregulated housing, tenements, things like that, basement apartments. Second space sort of resembles the northwestern part of the city where all the universities are, and people are buying expensive houses in order to get their children fed into these universities. But then first space kind of feels like the glitzy sort of central business district in the southeast of the city where all the skyscraper glass gleaming buildings are and the most expensive real estate in the city is. So one of the things that is striking, I think, about Folding Beijing, Hao Jingfang's novel, is that in a way it sort of projects the current reality of Beijing into a future which has made these spaces more inaccessible to each other. And the reason that the protagonist is a waste management employee is that he can get access to second space through the garbage chute. And he can also, and he finds a guy who actually can get his way from third space, I forgot if it's third space or second space, to first space, which are usually not accessible to each other, by using the moment of the change to do kind of an acrobatic sort of run across the folding edge or the seam of the city that's coming up from the ground and sort of holding onto a bush or something while it's upside down. Oh, actually, I have a description of this process here that I can read for you, rather than trying to describe it in my own clumsy language. So the whole world started to turn. The sound of steel and masonry folding, grating, colliding filled the air like an assembly line grinding to a halt. The towering buildings of the city gathered and merged into solid blocks. So buildings would fold down and then become these sort of cubes. Neon signs, shop awnings, balconies, and other protruding fixtures retracted into the buildings or flattened themselves into a thin layer against the walls like skin. Every inch of space was utilized as the buildings compacted themselves into the smallest space. Where are the people? They're inside. When the change is going to happen, everybody has to get off the streets, go back to their apartments, get into a little cocoon-like cubicle where they go to sleep. They are given a kind of gas that keeps them from waking up, and sort of coffin-like they are folded into these buildings and buried underground, while the other half, literally, of the population lives on top of them, and then it switches all over again. So you can see how unrealistic this is, but in a way it kind of reminds you, and the way that Lao Dao's job is described reminds you a lot of Beijing besieged by waste. Here's a description of his job. Together with tens of thousands of co-workers, he mechanically and quickly sorted through the trash, picking out recyclable bits from the scraps of life from first space and second space, and tossing them into the processing furnace. Every day he faced the trash on the conveyor belt flowing past him like a river, and he scraped off the leftover food from plastic bowls, picked out broken glass bottles, tore off the clean backing from blood-stained sanitary napkins, and stuffed it into the recyclables can marked with green lines. This was their lot, to eke out a living by performing the repetitive drudgery as fast as possible, to toil hour after hour for rewards as thin as the wings of cicadas. 20 million waste workers lived in third space. They were the masters of the night. The other 30 million made a living by selling clothes, food, fuel, or insurance. But most people understood that waste workers were the backbone of third space's prosperity. And this is the same theme that Wang Jiuliang points out about the scavengers in the landfills and the people also sort of running these illegal landfills. You can criticize them for breaking the law and harming the environment, but without what they were doing, the garbage problem would be a lot worse than it already is. And the fact is the government sort of own sort of waste management procedures were far from meeting the volume of garbage being produced. Even back then in 2010, when the film was made, this problem could even be much worse now than it was then. The other story that I wanted to talk about real briefly is called The Flower of Shazui, which is a story which to me, is much more clearly influenced by cyberpunk. It's a story about a guy. The Shadzui is this place near Shenzhen, which is in the area near Hong Kong. Shenzhen is a great example for this talk because it was in the beginning of the reform and opening period in China after the fall of the Gang of Four and the death of Chairman Mao, when it was decided that China would adopt market-oriented policies to develop their economy. Shenzhen was one of the first special economic zones that was established. There wasn't very much there at that time, and it grew into this futuristic, ultra-modern, beautiful city, one of these cities of the future. It was even better than Shanghai because there's a lot of old Shanghai underneath all the glitz you saw. On the other side of the river, there's you see more of the old Shanghai. But Shenzhen was a brand new city. And around it were all these sort of satellite communities where people coming from poverty all over China would come looking for opportunity. And so the Flower of Shadzui is about what places like this are going to look like in the future, because there'll be huge population numbers of people living in these sort of tenement, again, sort of urban canyons of tall buildings. But there are also these aspects of cyborg and high technology. And so the other element that I actually neglected to mention that's very cyberpunk about this novel is that the narration of it is kind of in a noir sort of vibe. So the protagonist is a sort of hard-boiled guy who is trying to help a sort of damsel in distress, who in this case happens to be a prostitute, who is seeking out his technological expertise. So it's almost like a Bogart film in Kuwait here. That's also similar to Blade Runner, which of course the Harrison Ford character was a private detective. Yeah. And so this noir aspect adds a lot to this darkness and negativity of the cyberpunk aesthetic. So I just had a brief passage of description of this. It's actually a village. It's called a village of Shadzui near Shenzhen. Inside the apartments, the narrator says, it's always dark because there's so little space between the buildings that tenants in the buildings next to each other can shake hands through the windows. You get the Kowloon walled city image again. The alleyways are narrow like capillaries and follow no discernible pattern. The stench of rot and decay permeates everything, sinks into everyone's pores. Because the rent is cheap, every kind of migrant can be found here, struggling to fulfill their Shenzhen dream, the high-tech, high-salaried, high-resolution, high-life, high Shenzhen. And so you can see how the dark noir cyberpunk world is like a corollary of the aspirational, glitzy, gleamy world, city of the future world. They live next to each other, and the wonderful world of the future is always dependent on the things that go on in these darker spaces that we can see in both documentary films. And I think Wang Jiuliang's film is particularly apt to be compared, I think, to cyberpunk science fiction. But there are other filmmakers, and I could have brought clips from other films. I'll just give you one example verbally in my, let's say, final minute. I mentioned before Huang Weikai. He's a filmmaker based in Guangzhou, again near Shenzhen. It's a film called Disorder in English, which is not a translation of the Chinese title, but there's an interesting relevance of the Chinese title to this talk. The Chinese title roughly translates as "the present is the future of the past," and so there's a sense in which we are living in the future because we're living in the future that was imagined in the past. The way Disorder is made is particularly interesting, and it's not announced to the viewer. So in fact, the first couple of times I saw this movie, I didn't realize that it wasn't shot by the filmmaker. What he did was he took a dozen or 2 dozen amateur video artists or just amateur filmers, films that they had made of the city of Guangzhou, things that were going on. And he splices them all together into, without any voiceover, or explanation, so that you're moving among a number of different situations that develop somewhat over the course of the movie. But there's no evident logic to the montage. In other words, you don't know why you're looking at this now and then that afterwards. And for him, that is part of the theme of the film. So he didn't even direct this shooting. It's shooting that people are doing of their own city. But what he's doing is making it into a mosaic of contemporary life, which is made to look dark because he made it all black and white in order to sort of make a consistent visuality to the film. And it's ironic and it's absurd, right? It makes contemporary life in Guangzhou look absurd. And so I think it also fits into this argument. It also shows you how unusual some contemporary Chinese documentary films are. And so I'm going to keep pursuing this idea of how it might relate to the science fiction trend, which again was later than documentary. Documentary is starting to emerge in the 1990s, but this science fiction craze or trend really only started about 2014. Liu Cixin's Three-Body Problem, I think, was published in Chinese about 2010, and then it was published in English translation in 2014. So this is a much more recent phenomenon, but I guess I'm going to leave you just with the idea that I think it was somewhat influenced by the independent documentary films that have been made over the past, over the 15 years or so before that. So I'll leave the rest of the time for questions, and I thank you for your patience.
Just a quick question. So Chinese, if I understood your last comment correctly, Chinese science fiction is pretty new.
Yes. Well, there's a new wave.
Yeah, okay.
So I can back up with this a little bit.
Right.
I talked about the old science fiction, which existed sort of under the influence of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, where there were flying machines and again it was a lot about transportation, but it was also about, because Chinese 120 years ago were thinking a lot about the way society is structured, because they were in a declining dynasty, and the whole sort of dynastic emperor system seemed not to be working, and a lot of people were trying to go back to the drawing board and figure out what Chinese society should look like. And so science fiction, in addition to many other forms of writing, contributed to this. So that's one thing. During the socialist or communist period after 1949, when the PRC was established, there was a widespread interest in science per se, which led to science fiction as a form of science education. And because it was much more sort of government controlled and produced, it was much more about all the wondrous things that we'll be able to achieve in socialist China in the future. And there still is a kind of a thread like that. And this continued on actually when I was in college in the early 80s. There was a wave of science fiction in the early Reform and opening period, which was kind of influenced by this already existing fascination with science, but it was starting to wonder about things in a way that wasn't entirely positive and wasn't just trying to work out government policies. What I always thought was odd was that this little sort of blip of science fiction in the early 80s kind of just disappeared. And I think there was always like a hardcore science fiction community in China, but they were not conspicuous in the media. There weren't major authors among their numbers. A lot of them were probably appreciating translated science fiction. There were, I think, magazines devoted to it, but it wasn't considered a thing, really, for a long time. Only, as I say, Liu Cixin's emergence on the scene well after the beginning of the 21st century really led to an unprecedented new sort of trend and a phase of Chinese science fiction, which I think is the first one to really take on this sort of cyberpunk point of view on reality. And this is also partly due to the new influence of all kinds of, all the different great science fiction writers in the 20th century. So it is a long story, but this is just the latest chapter in it. Well, I thank you all for coming, and I really enjoyed talking with you.